in St. Louis. He has presented classes on Judaism for various institutions that include St. Louis University, Aquinas Institute, Webster University, Washington University Lifelong Learning Institute, Central Agency for Jewish Education, and several churches in the St. Louis area. Please welcome Sheldon today.
Good morning. So we're going to be talking about the authorship of the 5 books of Moses. And do we have the slides up, Judy?
I'm pulling them up right now.
Okay. Asking the question, who wrote those 5 books? It's kind of like the old Groucho Marx program where he has this quiz show. And one of his classic questions that he would ask a contestant was, who was buried in Grant's tomb? And surprising how many times people said, well, it must be Robert E. Lee or Abraham Lincoln. Isn't the answer obvious? Next, Judy. So the answer is not necessarily obvious when we talk about the 5 books of Moses. Next slide, next one, please, Judy. Next one. Good. The answer is not obvious. It has not been obvious for some time. Biblical scholars have questioned the authorship going back to the 12th century. And a biblical commentator named Ibn Ezra looked at the text, and although he was very committed to the idea of Moses' authorship, he saw some things in the text that made him wonder. The text said, the book of Deuteronomy, which is the 5th of the 5 books, the text that Moses delivered the speech from the other side of the Jordan River. Well, if the author of the text was on this side of the Jordan River, the west side, and the speech was delivered on the east side, it's inconsistent because the text says Moses never crossed the Jordan River, that he died east of it. So Ezra started questioning it. And then he looked into the text in terms of, it talks about the death of Moses. How could Moses have written about his death? So he opened up the door by saying, well, it probably mostly was written by Moses, but perhaps on his death, someone, maybe Joshua, filled in the missing pieces. It kind of left it sacrosanct that these are Moses's texts. Until about the 16th century, when a man named Baruch Spinoza, who was a Jewish philosopher, looked at the text, read it, and he concluded there were so many inconsistencies, so many redundancies, so many things that are improbable, that it could not have been written by Moses. That probably the original text Spinoza held was probably lost somewhere along the line of the travels of the Jewish people, and people tried to fill in for what they remembered of the text. And so he held that the 5 books of Moses really was not sacrosanct, and it was not Moses' authorship. And that kind of earned him the enmity of the entire Jewish community of Amsterdam, where he lived, and not only the Jewish community, but it alienated the Catholic community as well. So we've been until the 19th century laboring under the impression that this is Moses's writing, dictated to him by God, and we've treated the text in that way. In the late 19th century, 2 German Protestant theologians studied the text, and they concluded there were at least 2 different writing styles in the text. And of the authors, one author kept referring to God as Elohim, and the other author kept referring to God as Yod He Vav He, or Yahweh. They concluded that their text was written by two people who they identified by the initials J for the German word for Yahweh, which is Yahweh, and E for Elohim. And it kind of stayed that way until the 20th century, when a number of American scholars started studying the text, and they concluded that there are more voices than just J and E in the text. And they identified them as P1, P2, P3, D1, D2, D3. So we have multiple authors in the text, and that's what we're going to be talking about today. We're going to talk about what's called the documentary hypothesis. And what we will be looking at is the structure, how the text is structured. Next week, what we'll do is we will take the text apart and in terms of three stories I'm sure that you know, and we'll talk about who wrote those stories and what was the message that they were delivering. Because part of contemporary scholarship is using what I refer to as the documentary hypothesis, and trying to understand what the story the author was trying to tell us. So what they came up with is an idea of source criticism, which is the technical term that is used, that the story on the top level is a metaphor for the real message that the author was trying to deliver. And so we'll go into that as well. Next, please. Okay, so traditionally, we have read the Bible through a lens that has told us that this is the inherent word of God and its literal truth. Next, please. And if the biblical laws are God's laws, and then they should be accepted on the basis of faith and they not altered. Next, please. Vast number of modern people find the narratives incredible and the text is somewhat irrelevant. Next, please. What we'll be talking about is described by contemporary scholars as the historical allegorical approach to the Bible study. Next, please. That is not what God said in terms of the text, but what these ancient authors said in response to their perception of God's presence in history. So I have a text here, and hopefully you can see it, that is color-coded by who the author was, and then provides an explanation of what the source was trying to reveal. My copy is edited by Richard Elliott Friedman. There are many other scholars who have done similar work. I happen to like Richard Elliott Friedman's work. Next, please. So what we were talking about is what the story meant in the historical setting in which it was written. And that's really what we're going to be getting into next week. This week, I want to explain to you the whole process and how we identify who the authors were and what they were trying to say. Okay, next, please. When they wrote the stories used metaphors as a means for conveying symbolic meaning. So metaphors, the text is allegorical. It allows us to see something as something else. So we might be reading the story of Jacob and Esau, but they were just the metaphors. The story is really, the authors tell us, not about Jacob and Esau, but about Israel and its relationship with Edom. More about that later. Okay, next, please. Okay, so historically, there were four prevalent assumptions when we read the Bible and interpreted. One, that it was divinely given, that God spoke to his prophets, namely Moses, because the text says that. And the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, and thus the Lord, the God of Israel, etc. In fact, the very conclusion of the text says this was a text given to God given to Moses by God. So historically, we have viewed the text as divine. Next point. And yet, because of the authorship, there was a number of redundancies, duplicate stories. There are missing pieces. There are things that don't fit together. So the conclusion was that the text was cryptic and it contained hidden meanings. And therefore, what was really important is not just reading the text, but historically that there were theologians who could interpret the text for us and give us another story. So people like Rashi, Nachmanides, Ibn Ezra, Rashbam, etc., wrote their own stories about what the story of the text meant. And this became how we understood the biblical text through the eyes of Rashi or Nachmanides, etc. Okay, next bullet. We viewed it historically as a book of lessons directed to readers, telling them what to do to be obedient to the word of God in their own day, even though the text is really based upon ancient historic events. Next quote, please. And that's really the last assumption was it contains no contradictions, duplications, or inconsistencies. And when they do appear in the text, and they do appear, they can be perfectly harmonized. Let me give you an example. The text tells us that Jacob's name was changed from Jacob to Israel. And it happened as he was crossing the Jabbok River, and he wrestled with an angel and God, and as a result, God changed his name. But after that, after his name was changed to Israel, the biblical text keeps referring to him as Jacob. Sometimes it goes back to Israel, sometimes it goes back to Jacob. It's inconsistent. So the biblical commentators have to develop a rationale for that in terms of, so to make sure that it really wasn't a contradiction. Obviously, we know today that it was really just the fact that there was multiple authors telling different stories about this man, Jacob or Israel. Next, please. So there became different ways of reading the Bible historically, what we call Peshat. Meant we read the Bible and we just took at the surface level in terms of the ordinary meaning of the words, and that really in terms of was a first reading. But then we had to use the midrashes contained in the text by Rashi or Nachmanides or Ibn Ezra, or etc. And we developed an interpretive meaning, and that really became the real meaning for people who were doing Bible study. And those stories that Rashi would tell really was meaning to update the text by at a later date. Next, please. So modern scholarship has provided us with insights as to when the biblical texts were written, what groups of people wrote them, and insights on what the text meant to the various authors. My wife, Michelle, and I were in Israel. We took a private tour. Hired our own guide about 10, 12 years ago. We had done all the synagogue and temple tours when we did the Federation tours, and they're all worthwhile. But there was a number of things I wanted to see pertaining to First Temple Judaism, particularly as it related to the period of the Roman domination and the separation of Christianity from Judaism. So I wanted to get to see sites that were not very on most tours. We hired a private guide, and it turned out this guide was not only he was studying for his doctorate in Judaism, and he had a wealth of information. Did a terrific job in explaining to me what we really wanted to know, but moreover, he let me know that he was studying modern scholarship, the documentary hypothesis, and introduced me to a number of these readings and the materials I should be reading about, the basic texts. And for the last 12 years, I keep getting papers from him a couple of months in terms of what other scholars in Israel at Bar Ilan University or Hebrew University are doing in this whole area of biblical scholarship in terms of trying to better understand the meaning of the text when it was written. So that is part of what we'll be talking about today. Next slide, please. The editing of the text really took place during the period of Babylonian exile, which is after the Babylonians conquered Judea, the southern state, and they exported Jews, all the Judean leadership, to Babylonian. They took with them their scrolls, or as much as they could take, which kind of indicates in terms of how important they thought those scrolls were to them. These same people watched the destruction of the community, their family members, the king was killed, the temple had been burned down and destroyed, sacred sites looted, and they were concerned, how can we preserve Judaism in exile? And so there were these independent scrolls all put together by different scribes who worked for different priests, were transported from Judea to Babylonia. And the exiles were concerned, how are they going to preserve their identity? How are they going to prevent assimilation that was that had occurred in the northern kingdom when it was conquered by Assyria, and preserve it in Judaism and make it a viable identity for the adherents from Judea. And they concluded that all these independent scrolls that people have been writing had to be compressed and consolidated into a book form. Next slide, please. Or as we would call a book form, which was for them was a scroll. They were concerned about, did God revoke the covenant with the Judeans? And if so, why? Next, please. Okay. How can they worship God in a foreign land without the physical framework of what was required by biblical law in terms of the temple? Next, please. And what are they going to have to do to maintain Jewish identity in this alien environment? Last one, please. Next. And how will Jews survive as a people without geographical and political trappings of nationhood? And they concluded, the scholars in exile, who primarily was Ezekiel at first, concluded that they needed to put together all these individual writings of what people had, what various scribes had contained, and make it a theology. Make it the basis for preserving Judaism. Wherever Jews would go, they could bring their scrolls with them. But did they have all the scrolls that were written? We don't think so. Scholars do not think that they were probably missing scrolls. Were there scrolls that didn't fit within the overall context in terms of this narrative that was being consolidated in the Torah? Scholars believe that's also true, that there are scrolls that were left on the cutting room floor. So what we have is what ended up being consolidated. Next slide, please. Okay, let's move to the next slide. Okay. The key for understanding who wrote the text and when it was written and what events they were referring to allegorically is based upon language. The Hebrew language, like most languages, changed over a period of time. But the Hebrew language in this period of time even changed more rapidly. Because as a language, Hebrew doesn't come into existence until about 1100 BCE. So all the events concerning the patriarchs and whatever existed relative to those the patriarchs, to the extent it was written, which it got written during the next several hundreds of years using a very old form of Hebrew that was derived from the Ugaritic language, which is derived from the Akkadian language. And over time, as Hebrew became more refined, there were dramatic changes made over the period of time in terms of when the writings were made. So we can trace the development of Hebrew over Israel's history, or at least scholars can, not me. And the pre-exile, pre-Babylonian exile, has been verified by inscriptions on archaeological discoveries. Post-exile biblical Hebrew, the Hebrew that was written during this period of time in Babylonia, was verified through the Dead Sea Scrolls. So language becomes the principal source for our being able to date when the text was actually written. And therefore we can identify who the source of it is. Next, please. So there's multiple voices in the text. Each voice originates in a different time period. Each voice has a different perspective. They're not uniform. They're the voices differ based upon the time frame and what Judeans were experiencing during that period of time. They provide evidence of a very politically charged environment in Judea, a conflict between the north and the southern kingdoms, and the conflict between the priests of the northern kingdoms and the southern kingdoms. The texts were written originally from an oral tradition, edited over multiple years. Source documents were ultimately compiled in exile by what most scholars believe was by Ezra, and layered to create a comprehensive text. So let me explain the meaning of layering, and that is because we're going to get to see that the impact of that, not this week, but next week. Layering means that a story might have been started by the biblical author E, but then P comes along and he's writing about it also, giving a different perspective. So the P perspective gets layered on top of the E perspective. So we have a number of different stories which have multiple perspectives. Some don't fit. Some were eliminated on the cutting room floor, and to tell the story that ultimately Ezra wanted to tell. So the outcome is a text that represents a complementary and yet sometimes a conflicting perspective written over a 600 to 700 year time frame. Next, please. So this is the model that I want to talk from, and we'll be using it today to explain each of the authors of the text. On the bottom, looking at the bottom, is a graphic listing where each of the blue arrows or pointers represent a century. So it's a timeline from 1200 BCE to 300 BCE. Inside the timeline, in black print, you see major events that occurred, kind of mark it. So between 1000 and 900, you'll see the kingdom of David and Solomon, and ultimately by 900, actually 920, the Israel is divided into a northern and a southern kingdom. The northern being called Israel, the southern kingdom called Judea. Then moving forward to the right, again on the bottom line, you see it by almost to 700, where Israel is taken into captivity in Assyria by the conquest of Assyrians by Assyria. So the whole nature of the northern kingdom, Israel, changes during that time frame. Moving further along the line, the next black line, you see the destruction of Jerusalem takes place 586, and then you see the return from exile following that in about 40 years. And then you see, finally, just before you get to the 400 timeline, you see Ezra presenting the final product to the Judeans in terms of this editing process. So now let's go to the top. What it shows, this description shows that what took place in terms of story development and the biblical narrative was oral until about somewhere between 1100 and 1000. So sometimes slightly before the entry of the Davidic monarchy, we have a group of priests and scribes who we call J. J is the scribes who use the terminology that God was always known by the name Yod He Vav He, or Yahweh. Okay, so the J scribe uses that terminology for the description of God. There are other markers that will help us identify, but for the most part, that's why it's J. You see a break off of J and E right at the point of the time that Israel is conquered, and where there is a division between Israel and Judea. So the E scribes were part of the priesthood in Israel, and they go south to Judah for reasons they don't want to be part of what's going on in the northern kingdom. And they start writing. They develop their own traditions of the same stories, and they start by about somewhere between 700 and 800. They start reducing their oral tradition into writing. Now, in 586, shortly before, between 600 and 700, closer to 700, the northern kingdom is conquered by Assyria, and there's large numbers of Israelites, people from the north who go to south. Archaeologists tell us that the population of the southern kingdom of Judea quadrupled during this period of time. So it could have only come from the northern kingdom. And so the J priests also go to the south, and they continue to write their stories. And so we really have, for a period of time, competing priesthoods and competing stories. With a large number of people who living in Judea, who found whose roots were in Israel, the priests concluded, let's put it all together. Let's merge our texts. Let's merge our theology. And so J and E form a combined text. So there is a redactor who takes J's stories and E's stories and combines them. In some areas, the J stories survive. Some stories, the E stories survive, and they get merged together. And in some places, new stories emerge. Okay. So now let's drop down from E to P. We're now in the southern kingdom. We're still in the southern kingdom of Judea. And a group of priests, namely priests, led by a priest who identifies himself as a descendant of the chief priests at the time of King David, and they form a separate group. And they are concerned with respect to codifying the priestly edition. So amongst other things, they write the book of Leviticus to document in terms of that. And they continue to write into exile and pretty well play a dominant part in determining what of J and E gets preserved and combined into their text in terms of P. So at one point, it's believed that P had his own text. And the three texts are merged into one. So we have, in terms of the books of Genesis, Exodus, Numbers, and Leviticus. Basically, the writings of three authors. Leviticus is primarily only P. When P took a lot of the J.E. stories and put into those stories some of his own interpretations to heighten the role of God's presence in the Judean history. So by way of example, the story of the crossing of the Red Sea, the Reed Sea, really, the Red Sea is really an E story. P decides to take the story and add the miraculous parting of the waters, and God blew on the waters and parted the waters. So P loves miracles, and he edited many of these stories from J and E. Okay, so we have a combined text of J, E, and P. Lastly, we have D, which is the Deuteronomist. We don't know the origin of the Deuteronomist. It's clearly a southern kingdom work. It starts during the period of the kingdom of Hezekiah and goes on to Josiah, because they identify many of the factors in terms of that occurred in that historic period into the text. And D writes not only the book of Deuteronomy, and there is no P editing of Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is pure one author. And D also writes the books of Samuel 1 and 2, Kings 1 and 2. So D is really then give us a lot of history, or his take on history. Okay, so that's where we're at. Next slide, please. So language becomes the key in terms of understanding who wrote it and when the text was written. So both the Hebrew of J and E come at the various early stage of the biblical Hebrew, when it was really being created as a language from the symbols that were formerly used in the Akkadian language and the Ugaritic language, which were just under sounds. Hebrew becomes a language. P comes from the stage immediately prior to the Babylonian exile, and D is written from Hebrew that was used also during prior to the Babylonian exile. The early stage of development of each form of Hebrew is verified by archaeological discoveries, inscriptions on various tombs or buildings, and can also be confirmed, the later stage confirmed from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which of course were carbon dated. So we can identify specifically through the carbon dating process when those were written. Next, please. So proof of the hypothesis that there are multiple authors, there are more than 30 cases of doublets, stories that are repeated in one sense or another in the Torah, with some differences in detail. When separated out by terminology, each source can be individually identified. There are numerous inconsistencies in the text that we have, with one story following the other, or different stories appearing in different books. And we will get to that next week. I'll demonstrate that. Okay. And it cannot be explained as a way of an editor trying to emphasize a critical point, or that the way things were done in the ancient texts. It's solely a matter of combining sources. Next, please. So we talked about from 928 to 722, there were two separate kingdoms. And E clearly has identified a number of elements connected with the southern kingdom. E is writing about the Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, all the leaders of the tribes of the southern kingdom. The brothers, and I'll say brothers in quotation marks, because biblical scholars tell us they are not brothers, never were brothers. Okay. That it was a myth created that Jacob had 12 sons. The myth was created so that we could form a linkage, a common identity, a Bill of Rights, a constitution to work with, so that Reuben, the tribe of Reuben, the tribe of Simeon, the tribe of Levi, and the tribe of Judah had some common identity. And the same can be said of the northern tribes. They're not tribes. The named tribes of Ephraim and Manasseh, Benjamin, Issachar, were never brothers of had a common ancestor. They were just separate tribes that merged together. So J's connections, unlike E's, are disproportionately in the northern kingdom. So they're going to write about Joseph and his two sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. They're going to write about Benjamin, etc. So we also know that the J, being a northern tribe, is very critical of the royal family of David. Next slide, please. The J text was written during the divided kingdom from 928 to 722 by priests living at Bethel. It uses the proper name of God, Yod He, Vav He, or Yahweh, in all the stories of the patriarchs. It includes the stories of the early stories prior to the patriarchs, of Adam and Eve and the flood story. Those are all J's story. It details the story of Joseph and also and some of Moses, okay, and some elements of Moses. It contains no information on the plagues within Egypt or anything else that occurred within Egypt. So it's believed that the J author has very little understanding of the Exodus. it's very, the J author is very critical of David, Solomon, and Solomon's son Rehoboam. Next slide, please. E. This is written during the southern, the divided kingdom in the south, and the E priests claim to be descended from Moses. The J, okay, and they are living in Shiloh in the northern kingdom, and they ultimately, when the kingdom is divided, they migrate south to Judah. They indicate that the name of God of Yod He Vav He was not known until Moses, and the name used for God prior to Moses was Elohim. Okay, so there was what E talks about, refers to, and in the text, and we'll see some of that next week, is that there's a transformation in terms of the understanding of who God is, and that the God originally worshipped in the northern kingdom of Israel is not the same God that the Jews worshipped after the return from Egypt. The emphasis of the E text is on the story of the Exodus. He's very favorable to the royal family of David, and has some stories that parallel the stories of J, but with a different context, a different conclusion. Next slide, please. J and E, as I talked about earlier, get combined into a single work by a redactor. So some of the edges get smoothed out, others still remain. Okay, let's move on. Next slide. When the sources are separated, J and E, from one another, we can reach each text as a complete narrative. So you can recognize that what we have available to us, is a combined text, and each of the separate texts, when we separate them, have a great deal of continuity. The combined J is a flowing text with only minor gaps, where the redactor, that's R, made cuts in what he received, and also there are interjections, as I talked about, by P, providing his own or their own takes or insights into the text to generally to expand God's role in the stories being told. Next. So this is the same diagram. We'll talk a little bit about J, and then we'll talk about E and P and D. Okay, let's move on. Next. The P text described as such because its central concern is the priesthood and the practices within the temple. It was produced in Jerusalem by priests believed to have been descended from Aaron, or at least they claimed they were descended from Aaron. And they continued writing the P text into Babylonia, even during the exile. So the stories of P are more current than are J and E. And to some degree, they parallel the J-E stories to some extent, but they provide different insights into the texts. P's texts generally give us laws and instructions, and they contain significant parts of the book of Exodus and Numbers and all of Leviticus. And P will assert that Leviticus was that the law-giving process that started on Sinai was continued throughout the desert experience, so that the book of Leviticus was, according to them, was a continuous writing process. Like E, I should say, P also subscribes to the fact that the name Yod He Vav He Yahweh was not known until the time of Moses, and that the patriarchs all worship a God named named Elohim. Okay. Next slide. P has elements that connected to the time of King Hezekiah, which gives us an insight that that's probably when P started writing. Okay. And he devotes a great deal of attention to the construction of the tabernacle, which is the largest section of the entire biblical text, is the various texts concerning the construction of the temple. And recognizing it as the central place of worship where God revealed many of his laws to Moses is in that tabernacle. Next slide. So now we'll move on to D. D starts writing a little earlier than P. D takes up all the book of Deuteronomy, and it has another law code in the book of Deuteronomy, and concludes with the parting message of Moses. D gives him the name to his text in Deuteronomy, and he calls it the Torah, the teaching, which later the redactor, Ezra, presumably, gave the same name to the Torah as the overriding title for all of the 5 books. But it's only in D where the author tells us that this is the Torah, this is the teaching that Moses gave us. And it contains some sources, which scholars believe may even be older than J and E, but it probably was not, in terms of from an oral tradition, it probably was not reduced to writing until King Hezekiah and King Josiah, which was immediately prior to the Babylonian exile. D is also part of a much larger work. So the author who wrote D really wrote other books. He wrote the book of Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. D was a historian. D was trying to give us a view of the history of ancient Judea from the Exodus on. Next slide. Let's go next slide again. Let's do it another one. Let's skip another one. Okay. Key is what we talked about, is the use of God's name in the text. God's name in different sources vary when the name Yud, He, Vav, He, Adonai was revealed. J says it was known from the earliest generation of humans. And E and P state the name Adonai or Yud, He, Vav was not revealed until the generation of Moses. And they identify the God of the patriarchs as El, Elohim, El Shaddai. Next week, I'm going to get into that, and you'll see how that all emerged and how that evolved. The sacred objects, the ark, is critical to Israel's travel success. And E is never mentioned in J. So they both, E and J, are reporting on the Exodus, but it's only E that deals with the ark and Israel's military success. The cherubs that are over the ark in P aren't mentioned in E or D. The objects that we call Urim and Thummim are never mentioned in J, E, or D. So P is adding these things and the miracles performed with Moses' staff. In P, it's Aaron who does it. In E, it's Moses who's doing it. So P has an affection for Aaron because they claim descent from Aaron. Next slide. Certain words appear disproportionately or unevenly. In the interest of time, let's advance. Let's go advance to another slide. Another one again. So the text has multiple voices. Each voice originates in a different time period. Each voice has a different perspective. They speak of the times in which they were written. They provide evidence of a politically charged environment. the environment that the authors lived in. They were written from an oral tradition and rewritten over a 100-year period. The source documents have been compiled and layered to create a comprehensive text, yet we can pull it apart by knowing who the author was. The biblical text represents complementary and sometimes conflicting perspectives written over a 600 to 700 year time period. Next slide, please. Next slide. So in the books, Genesis, we have all four authors, or we have J, E, and P, and the redactor who wrote part of the Genesis. Exodus, again, four different authors. Leviticus, we have P and the redactor who revised some Leviticus. Numbers, we have J, E, P, again, the redactor, combining sources. And Deuteronomy, we only have D as the author with some editorial changes made by redactor to make it fit into the overall theme of the five books. Next slide. Okay, let's move forward. The biblical authors used stories. Stories were the vehicle that they used, that they created or invented, modified as a vehicle for communicating their message, and their theology. Next. And they used it to tell us about significant events in history of the Jewish people, and the nature of humanity, and their insight into God's will, into the history that they were writing about. Next slide, please. It's written, the Pentateuch, or the five books of Moses, is written allegorically. Allegorical is a device where a figurative treatment of one subject under guise of another typically expresses meaning by the use of people as metaphors for events or actions that have an interpretive representation. And there are two levels to the story. The first one we know, it's clear, we read it. It is on the surface level. You know the characters and you know the plot. But what biblical scholars have identified is what the stories really meant at the time they were written. And that is the symbolic level. This was a technique used in the ancient world, not just in Judea, but all over. The Greeks wrote stories that way. The story of Homer's, the Iliad, and Achilles. And then there was a real Achilles. He was as real as General Patton. But the stories were really were written to demonstrate key points that the author wanted to talk about. So the Greek stories had how God, their understanding of God, influenced the events in terms of the outcome of the Trojan War, and the lessons that kings should learn about frivolous warfare. The Romans did the same thing. The story of Aeneas, Romulus. There was, in all probability, an Aeneas and a Romulus. And the stories were kind of built to create a message that the author wanted to communicate in terms of a theology. The same thing true was in terms of some of the early Egyptian stories, which are much earlier than any of the Greek and Jewish stories. The story of those in the Mesopotamian story of Gilgamesh, who it contains a flood story. Again, was there a Gilgamesh? It's hard to say. It's too early. But we know in terms of the story about this character is geared to us. The Babylonians learning a message about history through myths. The same thing can be talked about in terms of the Babylonian story of our Mesopotamian story of Sargon, who evolves and from, according to the story, rescued out of a wicker boat from a river. I think you've heard that story before somewhere else, the Moses, and obviously it's borrowed from the Sargon story. And Sargon rises to become a great king, and there probably was a Sargon. Okay, and the myths were created to talk about what the lessons learned from Sargon's life. So in the ancient world, the stories had meaning. The stories on the surface level, we know who the characters and the plot was. But all the stories in terms of mythology, ancient mythology, had a inner level, a philosophical meaning in terms of what the story represents. So let me give you an example. It's an illustration from the Jewish Bible, from the Torah. We'll take the story of Jacob and Esau, just because I mentioned it earlier. Jacob, of course, according to the story, cheats or gets a birthright, which enables him to rule, and Esau take a secondary role. And the story is justified because Jacob is domestic. He is concerned with agriculture. He's a homebody. Esau is a hunter, is a nomad, and probably would, what the story is telling us, is probably not fit to rule a nation state. So what the story, scholars tell us that Jacob is obviously a synonym for Israel, because his name gets changed. It's synonym, he represents Israel. And Esau represents Edom. What we know from archaeology is that Israel and the Edomites at one time were a combined people. They lived together in the same area. And at one point, it was a very cooperative relationship, but it comes apart. And the Edomites become enemies of Israel. The Edomites, unlike Israel, which it becomes an agrarian society, the Edomites become a nomadic society, and continuously for thousands of years wage war against Israel. So what scholars believe the story is telling us is a rationale for why two tribes that were once very close and worked cooperatively suddenly come apart and become antagonistic towards one another. So we'll see other stories like that next week. But I wanted you to, in terms of what I meant about the surface level versus the symbolic level. If you only stay at the surface level, the story is amusing, entertaining, but it doesn't provide much in the way of teaching points. Next slide, please. So the question is, how do you read a text that is allegorical? Allegorical, where on the surface level, people are metaphors, okay? Metaphors for something larger, something else. So the challenge is you have to interpret the hidden meaning at the time that intended by the author, at the time the text was written, concerning the actions and the people involved in the events on which the author is reporting. So some of the criticism of source criticism is the fact that it requires somebody, a subgroup of scholars, to develop a hypothesis, a theory. It cannot be proven, but what in all likelihood the story meant at the time. Next slide, please. Next, please. Next one. Myths in the ancient world, which I say were prevalent from Greece to Egypt to Rome to Mesopotamia, were written so that societies could understand the world that they lived in and the critical events that shaped their world. Next slide. Next point. An event does not, or action does not have to have actually occurred for it to contain a truth. Okay. Next. Truths speak to the values the society and the culture hold to be the highest importance in the view of the author. Next. Colonel Jessup, good old Colonel Jessup. You recall the movie A Few Good Men. It was played by a Marine colonel, was played by Jack Nicholson, and he's called in by his superiors in terms of to justify what he was, the action he was taking. And the superiors had not been near the battlefield. And Colonel Jessup, or Jack Nicholson, says, "Truth, you can't handle the truth." Next, and that's probably what happens in terms of, I think, many people reading the text, learning about the documentary hypothesis and the interpretation of the allegorical meaning of the story. They just can't handle the truth that the story isn't about Jacob and Esau. It's a story about ancient Israel and its neighbor Edom. So, and we go on all story after story. We'll do a couple next week. What the biblical text was believed to have meant was interpreted centuries after it was written by rabbis or biblical commentators, Rashi and Nachmanides, etc., to develop meaning the generations for whom they were writing, because the allegory had been lost. Next slide. Myths in the ancient world developed over a period of time as people struggled to find their enduring truths. Next one. It began with primitive encounters with the forces of nature. So every culture has a creation story, and eventually it extended to relationships with one another within the society, and ultimately with other nation states that they interacted with. The greatest mythological stories contain elements of historical events, the relationship of humans with the divine, who they perceive to be an actor in the history. So stories like Aeneas and Beowulf are unique and important to their development of their culture. And that's really the way the biblical authors wrote. Next, please. They are the vehicle by which cultures pass their most important values and beliefs to future generations to create a sense of continuity. Next slide. It's a mistake to dismiss as irrelevant and accepting only documented history as relevant. Something does not have to actually have occurred for it to contain a truth. And that is true in terms of the biblical text. What passes for history today is not a systematic recording of events, but we get interpretations from CNN, or Fox, or MSNBC, whoever we're listening to. Interpretation of events. Modern historians and interpreters are interpreters, and certainly we're getting a lot of different interpretations today. The biblical authors created myths to comment on the lessons learned from their history and their interpretation of historic events. Next, please. Reading a story can be described as a parable, a biblical story as a parable. Looking for proof misses the entire point. Seeking literalism is inconsistent with what the authors were trying to do. So we're trying to, when we try to look at in terms of look for a little literalism in the text and history, we're missing the point. When we read the biblical text, We don't care if the story is true. What's really important is understanding what the message that the author is trying to give us. Something does not have to have actually occurred for it to contain truth. What is relevant is the truth and the lesson learned from the story, not the story itself. Next, please. Next, let's go and let's skip this slide. So there are two in what we call critical biblical source analysis. There are two time frames: when the story was written, what did it mean at that time, and the setting of the story. Next, please. We need to know who the author was, identifying what was occurring at the time the story was being written, identifying the author's objective in writing the story, and whether it was to enhance Israel's understanding of its relationship with God, to establish significance of the historic events, or to initiate transformation within Israel. And a lot of stories are just for that. Next point. The story may be based upon remembered history, transmitted from generation to generation, embellished using characters from history, symbolically as role models. So we'll see a story in terms of where Abraham is 1,000 years after he died, is being written about, using him as a role model. Or it might be invented history that's expressed allegorically, as if it was really a real event. Next, please. What we need to know is who wrote the story and when it was written. And we'll demonstrate next week how that works. What historical or political event the author was writing about, what bias the author might have brought to the story, and they do have biases, much of it political, that scripture combines, I should say, historical memory and metaphorical narrative in a external story. So the objective of critical biblical source analysis in terms of reading the text is, one, what is the internal story? And that we can get pretty clearly from the reading. And secondly, what did it mean at the time it was written? And the internal story is going to be revealed by interpreting the allegorical story. So I ask you, what problem do you think exists in accepting the findings of modern biblical text study? And I'll tell you. Next slide, please. It's not the way I heard this story, Sheldon. Because when we look at the text, we're going to find that it is not the internal story, not the external. The internal story is not one that we're going to be familiar with. And that is the whole point. Next slide, next please. Can we? That's it. Thank you. So any questions? Anybody, any comments?
Actually, Sheldon, there is a question in the comment box. Ken Terschfelter asked, among biblical scholars, which books or topics are among the most controversial in factual content or interpretation?
Well, I'm not saying that. I mean, when you talk about facts, we're talking about history that actually occur. It's a difficult question to answer. There's some of the stories are invented. I guess the story that is most controversial is the story of the Exodus itself. Some of you probably know, I do at Washington University an 8-week, 3-hour class for 8 weeks on the Exodus story. Is it history? Not the way the story was written. Is it history in terms of did it occur? Yes. There was an Exodus. There was people who became enslaved that ultimately became part of Israel and Judea. So there are many stories that are controversial. Okay? None probably more controversial than the story of the Exodus. And yet, through archaeological studies, through text analysis, through studies of Egyptian mythology and stories, we know that there was an Exodus. Okay? Kent's asking about what are probably the least historical. It's obviously in terms of the early stories, in terms of Adam and Eve, the stories of Noah. Those early stories are just that. They fall in the same pattern as the stories of Sargon and the Mesopotamian stories. Okay.
There isn't any other in the comment box, and we are running a little short on time, but we could take another couple questions. If Carol, would you like to unmute yourself?
Did that work?
Yes.
Good for
Hello,
me.
Carol. How you
All right.
doing?
Hi, how are you, Sheldon?
I haven't seen you in a long time.
I know it's been too long. Question. I've been like, as you are, I've been studying this my entire life. And I have a Teflon brain that keeps going away. Would you recommend a couple of hours of homework before our next session?
Oh, in terms of the text that I'm going to deal with?
Yeah, anything that might.
Sure. I'll tell you the 3 stories I'm going to deal with next week. Okay. The first is the revelation of God to Moses in terms of what his name is.
Okay.
So you might want to read that. Okay. And it is largely largely an E story. Then we're going to get to, after that, the story of Abraham's near sacrifice of his son, Isaac. Okay. And the third story is going to be the story of the golden calf. Okay. The worshiping of the golden calf. Okay. Now, they sound like, if you know the stories at all, you know that it sounds very different. They're very different kinds of stories. And yet we're going to find a common theme.
Okay.
Okay. That runs through all 3. Thank you, Carol.
Bob Cohn, you need to unmute yourself.
How's that? Now I'm unmuted.
There you
Anyway,
go.
Okay.
I want to make a comment. I've heard bits and pieces of these various series for a long time, but this is the most cogent and comprehensive and easy to follow analysis. Sheldon has a unique gift as a teacher to make complex issues very accessible. And I just wanted to express my appreciation for it.
Well, thank you, Bob.
Look forward to lesson number 2. I did take very thorough notes, but I thought it was very helpful that this, at the bottom of the screen, we have basically the text of your remarks. Sometimes there's some amusing mishearings of words, but
Right.
and if that could be made available in a printed out form, that might be helpful for further study.
Well, thank you for your comments. It's probably because I misspoke the words. And the reason it's so simple to follow is because I'm pretty simple-minded myself, and I have to reduce it to the kind of basics.
Well, I once had an assistant who asked, so that somebody from Epstein Hebrew Academy requested a copy of a picture of gold in my ear.
Okay.
This happened. Thank you, Sheldon.
Thank you, Bob.
Harvey Ferdman has his hand up. Would you like to unmute?
Yes, thank you very much. I'm just curious, and thanks for the presentation today. I can see a lot of study went into it. Has this changed your belief system at all?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Can you elaborate on that a bit, or can we do that in another session?
Well, it's hard to do. I mean, it's hard to do. I guess my own evolution is I look at our text and I say, this is what authors who were trying to create a moral and ethical society were telling us for their lifetime. How can I apply that or adjust it? And it's free. I'm free to adjust it, just as they are free to. We're free to create it. I'm free to change it any way that I feel is appropriate. But it also helps me better understand my own tradition. I don't know if that helps.
Barbara Tilton has typed a comment in the chat box as well. Deep thanks, Professor Enger. Ditto Robert's comments and on your presentation. So
Well, thank you. Well, thank you, Barbara.
I think with that, if no one else has a question today, we will have to continue this discussion next week, next Wednesday. Thank you everyone for coming. Thank you so much, Sheldon, for this very comprehensive, deep discussion. So everyone enjoy your day, enjoy your week, and we will see you next week.
Okay, and next week is
Great.
when I'll be pulling this all together in real live stories so that you'll have a better insight to it. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you. Spectacular.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.